It's a great pleasure to be here with Peter Gelb, the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera. Since we don't have too much time, I'll skip an elaborate introduction, but he's been at the Met, or as general manager of the Met, since 2006. Before that, he was in charge of classical music at Sony Records, the Sony classical label in America, and before that, served various roles in the classical music business as artist manager and film producer, and was the manager of Vladimir Horowitz for the last years of Horowitz's career. Let's just plunge right in and start off by asking in a very wide sense, what do you see as the role of classical music and opera in particular at this point in time in American culture, and what would you say to those who would describe it as a marginal or elitist art that may not belong in the middle of a sort of a mainstream conversation such as we're having here?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and that's a tough question because certainly classical music and opera, even perhaps more so, is always in the danger, I think, of becoming elitist and has edged into an elitist arena. And my job, and I think the jobs of others who run cultural institutions which are responsible for the management of these aging art forms of classical music and opera, is to fight against that and to make sure that the trust that is placed in us is to keep opera, in my case the Metropolitan Opera, and classical music from being elitist, and to make it as broadly available and as we possibly can, while at the same time maintaining and even raising the artistic standards. There's no question that opera and classical music represents it's high art, and the danger that can occur of an attempt to make it more accessible, of dumbing it down, is certainly to be avoided, and certainly we're trying to avoid that at the Met. But at the same token, one has to accept the idea that although it shouldn't be elitist, there is a limited audience for it. It is not pop music or pop art. It's high art, and yet it should be enjoyed, or can be enjoyed, if we provide the bridges, the vehicles for it to be enjoyed by a broader public than certainly an elite, narrow one.
Yeah, although, one thing you've demonstrated in just the short time you've been running the Met is that its popular appeal can be very easily underestimated, and I think many people have been quite astonished by the success of the Met's simulcast, high-definition broadcasts of opera live to movie theaters around the country, which has gained a great deal of attention. And one interesting thing about this is you'll probably have the exact statistics, but on certain weekends, the Met has landed in the top 10 or top 15 movies playing in America, right alongside these $100 million blockbusters. And here's this.
And just with one showing.
Yeah, just with one simultaneous showing in theaters all across the country. So it's. And I'll have to confess, when this idea was first proposed, my reaction was, well, that sounds terrific, and what a lovely idea, but are people really going to show up? And what gave you the sort of confidence going into that there might actually be an unsuspected national audience that really could fill movie theaters, sell out movie theaters week after week with opera?
Well, it was a combination of hope, optimism, and a little desperation, too. Because when I was appointed to take over the Metropolitan Opera, it not only was regarded as supremely elite in its approach to the public, it also was losing its audience, even the elite audience. And it was suffering from an aging audience that was declining. And in fact, the box office, the season I took over was 76% of capacity. We're now ending the second season since I've been general manager. We have one more week to go, and we're ending at 88% of paid capacity. And now it's very hard to get a ticket to the Met. And part of that is because of these high-definition transmissions, which were attempted to present a way in which the public, the opera-going public, and a new public could be introduced to the Met. And the model that we used, and which gave me hope that this would be successful, was, first of all, the history of the Met on radio, which was the Met has been broadcast on the radio for more than 75 years on Saturdays, which are the same matinee performances that we're now sending into as high-definition transmissions into more than 700 movie theaters around the world live. And the model of sports teams who have created a bond with their audiences through the increased electronic connection by transmitting their games via the internet, via radio, via giant television screens in sports bars. And when I was a kid, local sports games were blacked out. They aren't anymore. And the reason is that the sports teams have figured out that sports fans will actually be motivated to come and experience the real thing in the sports stadium the more they are exposed to sports through these transmissions. And opera is no different. Opera fans are as fanatical about opera as sports fans are about sports.
At least, yeah.
And they want the live experience. They want to know if Juan Diego Flores is going to sing his encore of A Mes Amis, as he did last week in La Fille de Regiment, and hit not only 9 high Cs but 18 high Cs in the span of 6 minutes. And they want to have that live experience. And so the risk we took was whether it would work or not. It was a risk we had to take, because if we did not galvanize the public very quickly, we were in danger of facing extinction, which sounds rather dire, but it was a dire situation. And that's why, in fact, the unions and the artistic community all agreed to participate in this experiment by creating a new economic model that would allow us to do this.
Right.
And, we have this video. I don't know if you...
Yeah, yeah. I want to come back to the issue of live versus sort of electronic, and all the a little bit of controversy that may surround that. But yeah, we do have the clip, and as glamorous and flamboyant as we are up on stage here, I think it would help to have actual opera singers and performers bringing a little more energy to the proceedings. So explain what we're going to see.
What we're going to see is a brief excerpt, or a compilation of excerpts from our production of The Barber of Seville, which actually represents a new theatrical direction the Met has embarked upon of hiring established theater directors. In this case, Bart Scher is one of the most celebrated directors working today, who just has the greatest hit on Broadway right now, actually north of Broadway in Lincoln Center, which is the new production of South Pacific. And Bart was brought in to stage his first opera at the Met, which was this production of The Barber of Seville, which features not only a very light and brilliant approach to the piece, which it should have, but also for the first time in the history of the Met, an extension of the stage that actually invades the audience space and goes beyond the proscenium. So if we could maybe take a look at that.
Yeah.
Largo sarcotum della città, largo. La 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 la. Presto, bottega che la magia, presto. La 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 la.
Si l'indoro mio sarà, lo giurai, la vincerò. A noi sarà un spirito, a me bambina, il mio cuore. mia felicità. Non fuggite, o lieti stati della mia felicità.
I think the wonderful thing about this, I mean, I've watched an awful lot of opera on video, and it always seems a little inadequate, and you can get an idea of what the singing was like, what the staging was like. But this, when you see it on a large screen, you're actually getting a fair substitute for these values that you experience in the house, the grandeur, the sense of the hugeness of the voices and of the stage, and so on. There's also this, I mean, the question arises, will these broadcasts begin to substitute for the live experience? I mean, some people may worry, as I think they do in other art forms, other media, are these new technologies eating away at the traditional practices of going out in the evening and experiencing things? Obviously, the statistics of the rising attendance suggest otherwise, but what do you generally say to that fear when it's raised?
Well, I say that the rising attendance suggests otherwise. And in fact, it's true. And not only has the Met benefited from these transmissions, but I believe that local opera companies across the country, and even as far away as in Europe, have benefited from them. It has created a kind of a new atmosphere for opera. And as satisfying as they are, and we have, I think that our productions are perhaps more interesting visually, not only because they're presented live on giant screens, but also because, since I have the dual role of running the Met and also producing these programs, the audiovisual programs, I can make decisions on behalf of both audiences, and such as having moving cameras inside the opera house that move discreetly so that the audience in the theater is not disturbed, but provide extra access visually to the performers. And one part of what we do, which is not shown in that video, is bring the audiences backstage so that they get an experience that the audiences even in the opera house don't get, which is they see the scenery moving and changing. We always enlist the aid of a non-singing superstar diva like Renee Fleming or Susan Graham or Natalie Dessay to be the backstage guide and host and reporter. And that person then interviews and guides the audience into the dressing rooms of the artists, where she talks to the stars who have just come off the stage. And it creates it's again, if you think of the sports as an analogy of this, it's the equivalent of going into the locker room during halftime of the Super Bowl. It's something that opera fans love, and it really just whets the appetite. As satisfying as it is in the movie theater, it makes you more excited about going.
That's the thing. Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is sufficiently advanced. It makes the experience so vivid that it actually creates this longing to really be there, as opposed to substituting, sort of giving you a feeling, well, this is sufficient in itself, and perhaps that explains the rising attendance. But as well, I mean, there are many other factors. I think the new theatrical approaches that you've introduced, a sort of wider gamut of productions, more concentration on new works now, especially going into the future. I want to ask about demographics, because this is always a topic that concerns people within classical music and outside of it. Is the audience too old? How do you make it more diverse? And I was wondering, first of all, what evidence you've seen of any changes in the last year or two. but also sort of wonder, I mean, why this constant pressure toward a younger audience? I mean, isn't it sufficient that you have all of these people showing up for opera, no matter how old they are?
Well, I mean, first I should say that we will accept any audience. we don't bar anybody at the door. It's simply a matter, though, of in order to ensure that there is a full house, that there is an audience, we need to bring new audiences in to replace the audiences that age and die. And it's really it's more of a question of an evolutionary process that had started to become imbalanced. So we're not, we welcome an older audience and we welcome a younger audience. We would like to have both. And that, in a way, is a kind of an artistic tightrope that I walk, because when I was engaged at the Met, to come to the Met, there was a great trepidation, I think, amongst the older audience members who were worried about anything changing the status quo. Now that they've seen that there are theatrical productions that honor the musical values but also make an opera like The Barber of Seville even a more enjoyable experience. Several board members said to me after the premiere of that, we never realized that The Barber of Seville actually was so funny. And of course, that's what it's meant to be, is funny. But the audience is we're not expecting, with the exception maybe of an opera like Satyagraha or a production of Dr. Atomic coming up, to necessarily have an audience that's predominantly young. First of all, our tickets are quite expensive. We have all kinds of programs to make less expensive seats available, but it's really a question of we want to draw upon a culturally aware, sophisticated audience. Many of our operas are in foreign languages. You have to be able to read subtitles in order to enjoy the opera. And you have to be willing, it's like the audience that will go to an art film and see a foreign film with subtitles. We're not expecting to draw upon, the audience for Mariah Carey. We would like perhaps a small segment of that audience if they're interested in opera.
More high notes. Here you go.
We have more high notes, right? We have 3,800 seats at the Met, which makes it perhaps the largest opera house in this country, and maybe one of the biggest ones in the world. Certainly much larger than the typical European house. So we don't need to have, to fill a sports stadium with young people. We just want to fill every seat in our theater.
Yeah, I mean, one obvious thing I think of is that older audience. Some of those people grew up in a time when classical music was still being talked about, heard on the radio, talked about in the leading magazines and so on. And that has really fallen off precipitously in the last 10 or 20 years. And I think one great thing that you've achieved is actually getting stories in the mass media, again, about opera. You were just named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential, powerful, colossal people of the year, something like that.
It surprised me.
Yeah, which is just amazing to have. I think the last time that happened was Stravinsky was named one of the 100 people of the century by Time. So I think, especially looking down the road 10 or 20 years, this might make a considerable difference.
Well, it's certainly. I think that my role in my job as running the Metropolitan Opera is to do everything within my imagination and what is possible to bring opera to the broadest possible audience. The performers want it. They are very eager participants, and the audience wants it. So it's the right thing to do.
It seems like it may be seen generally as a niche market, but it has the ability to leap into the mainstream in unexpected ways.
I think it can leap into the edges of the mainstream. Yeah. I don't think it will never be in the mainstream, simply because it's not. It is high art. They're talking about operas that are the shortest opera is maybe 2 hours. I mean, most operas are 3 hours, or sometimes as long as 4 hours. So it's not. It will never be. The mainstream popular culture, but it can be much more popular than it had become, and that's what we're trying to prove, and so far have proven. But certainly, we're not resting on our laurels at the Met. We need to, think of new ways of getting opera to a larger audience all the time.
Great. Well, unfortunately, I think we're just about out of time, but I really want to thank Peter Gelb for coming here, and I hope if you haven't already, some of you will We'll see the opera both live and in the movie theater. The season runs for about another week.
We have one more week
yeah.
to go. Our last performance is a week from tomorrow night of Macbeth, and then we have a concert in the park this summer on June 20th with two great opera stars, Angela Gheorghiu and Roberto Alagna, in Prospect Park, and we expect, if the weather is good, to have an audience of over 100,000 people there.
Right. And then he'll come roaring back in the fall with productions including John Adams' astonishing opera, Dr. Atomic.
A new production of that.
Which is about nothing less than the explosion of the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. So that'll be something slightly new for the Met.
Certainly new for the Met.
But thank you all very much, and thank you, Peter.